Hello and welcome to A Dev Named Josh. I am a dev named Josh, and today we're going to talk about spawning in nodes into the scene and shooting projectiles. Alright, so let's get started. The first thing we want to do is actually create a projectile, because right now all we have is our player character, and that's it. We have a main level and a player character. We need a projectile to shoot. So we're not going to create the projectile on the player character. Instead, I'm going to create a new scene by hitting the tab up here. Now we've made an empty scene, and I'm going to choose other node here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose an area 2D. An area 2D allows us to detect whenever a physics body enters the area, the trigger, the collider that's here. It will take a collision shape, and you would be able to tell that because you're going to get a node configuration warning that says the node has no shape, so it can't collide or interact with other objects. Consider adding a collision shape 2D. That's what we're going to do. I'm going to hit Control A, and I'm going to add a collision shape 2D. And of course, we need to set a shape for that collision shape, and I'm just going to do another circle. And there we go. So here's our circle. Now, we also want to see the projectile. Like I mentioned when we created the character, this collision shape will not actually show up in the game. This is just here for us to see where the collider is. So we're going to add a sprite. Control A, add a sprite 2D, and then I'm going to put the sprite above the collision shape just so that when I add a texture, I can still see the collision shape on top of it. So with the sprite 2D here, I need to add a texture, and yes, I am just going to reuse the default Godot icon again, but this time I'm going to shrink this down. And the way I'm going to shrink this down is by going to transform, and here on scale, if we click and drag, we will actually be able to change the value. Now, with that said, we can see that over here, there's this little like linked lock and chain between the X and the Y. That means that if I hold here and drag to the left, both X and Y are linked, so they're both going to change at the same time, which is great because it keeps our little square PNG here a perfect square. So I'm going to probably make it about that large. And then the only other thing I want to do is I don't want it to look identical to the player, right? I don't want this to be the same colors and whatever. So I'm going to come down to visibility here on the sprite 2D. And in modulate, I'm going to click here, and I'm over here. Modulate just lets us change the color or the hue of the object we have. I'm going to take the color, and I'm going to bring this all the way down to black, okay? And now, over here, our projectile is now black. Perfect. That looks good. So I'm going to save it, save the scene, and of course I'm going to I'm going to rename it before I save it actually, because I don't want it to be saved as area 2D. I'm going to call it projectile. Perfect. Now I will click Control S and I will save, and I'm just going to make sure it's capital projectile. There we go. So now we have a projectile scene, and we can actually make the player use this scene to instantiate this object, okay? So let's go back over to the player character, and we're gonna need another function that will accept input. So what we're gonna do is we're going to make a shoot function. And then down here, I'll give a couple lines and I'll say func shoot this, and it's not gonna return anything, so it's going to give us a void, so nothing. And I just noticed that I have forgotten to give my function a type here. So I'm going to do that really quick. All right, neither of these return anything. So if I were to like try to put a variable here, call it X, and assign it, X isn't gonna get anything. It's always gonna be null because move is not returning anything. It's void, okay? That is all that void means. So I have move and shoot, and here in shoot, I want to do something. Namely, I want to print, for now, bang, all caps. Okay. Now, the thing is, if I were to press play right now, shoot is going to happen all the time, regardless of my input. You can see it just keeps going. The reason for that is it's in the physics process, and we're not saying that it's gated behind any type of input like we are with like the movement over here, right? So like the move is also getting run as often, but it's just setting the velocity back to like 0, okay? That's all that's happening when move runs. But when shoot runs, we don't want it to just be shooting wildly at all times. Then again, maybe you're making a game like that. Neat mechanic idea. But we don't want it to be shooting all the time. So we need to stop it. So we could do an if statement right here. But this if statement is going to kind of take care of the input, okay? So it's going to look a lot like what happened up here. So we're going to say if, and then we know that we made an input. And on this one, we're not doing is action pressed. We're doing is action just pressed. The reason for that is action pressed will fire off the action so long as the button or input is held down. And is action just pressed will only fire off once, which is what we want. We want there to be a projectile that spawns every time we click the mouse or press the spacebar. So, and we called that action shoot. There we go. And I'll do a colon. And now we could technically keep it like this, okay? We could absolutely start writing all the rest of our code indented in this if statement. But and maybe this is just me, but it seems a little silly that we're even calling the function if we're not pressing the input, because we're not going to want to do anything down here. So what I'm going to do is, instead of putting it inside the function, I'm going to put it right here beside the shoot call. And now, if we press the shoot action, or if we try to shoot, it will go ahead and fire off the shoot function. But if we're not pressing the shoot action, if we don't press it, then it's not going to call this method, which is great. We're getting the same effect, but in this way, we're not having to go into the shoot function and then read the if statement and then come back out of it, right? All right. So with that said, I can re-indent this, and there we go. So now, if I press play and I press spacebar, we see bang. Every time I press spacebar and every time I click with my left mouse button, we see bang appear. And that's great. But now we need to actually spawn the projectiles we made here, okay? So how do we do that? We do that by getting a reference to our projectile scene, okay? So here in playerCharacter.gd, we are going to export var projectile so that we can assign it in the editor, much like we do with the speed multiplier. And this is going to be of type packed scene. What is a packed scene? You can think of this similar to the way that Unity handles passing in prefabs into scripts, or into serialized fields, or what have you. We can also pack up a scene, like projectile, and place it into the projectile, like exported variable in the editor. So let's see how that's done. If I go to player character, and I click here, we'll see we have projectile here. And now I can just pick up projectile, the whole scene, not the, if you have like a GD file or something, you wouldn't do that. You would do the actual scene and place it here. And now you've packaged that scene into that variable. Great. So now if we go back to the script, we know we have a reference to that scene. And so we can actually use this variable to spawn in projectiles because it understands all the data associated with the projectile scene. All right, but we're gonna have a problem if we do that, and that is we'll be spawning the projectiles on top of the player's like position. And I don't want to do that. So we're going to fix up the player here to give it a position to actually spawn the projectiles of, like you would for a barrel of a weapon or something. So here in the player character, I'm going to do Control A to get a new node, and I want it to be a position 2D node. And all this is, if I drag this out to the right, all this is a position in the world. And now we can say, hey, when I spawn an object, I want it to spawn here. Obviously, if you wanted to spawn it at the exact location of player character, you could use its position, whatever you want to do there. We're going to do it with a position 2D node off to the right here. Now the reason I'm pulling it to the right is because there's one other thing I want to do before shooting is going to really make any sense in this game. And that is, on the player character, we are not rotating the character towards the mouse, which I think is important for a twin stick shooter, right? We should always force the player to look towards the mouse position. So that's what we're going to do. And the way we're going to do that is here in move, because it's, well, it's not really part of movement. We're going to put it right below move, though, here in the physics process. And what it's going to be is we're going to call the function look at. And now look at needs a vector to point to actually make the character turn towards. And what we're going to do is we're going to set that to the output of another function. So this is mouse position is what we actually need. And we can get that by saying get mouse or get global mouse position. Now we have this variable that's holding this global mouse position, which is great. So we're going to actually use this mouse position in look at here. And we'll save it and we'll play. And we'll notice that he is turning towards the mouse position, but he's looking at it from the right, right? Like it's always facing his right side towards the mouse. Okay. Now there's a way to get around that if you wanted to change it to where it faced a little bit differently. Like there's a way to get around that. There's some math you could do. I'm going to be very lazy. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the player character and I'm going to turn the sprite by coming over here to the sprite's transform. And I'm going to turn the sprite by -90 degrees. Hit enter. Now he's facing towards this position 2D to the right. And now if we press play, we will notice that the character always kind of looks towards the mouse, right? So, lazy way to get around that. So, now back into the script. I don't like having to declare a variable here and then use it here. So what we can do is we can actually just take the function because it's going to return the vector2 mouse position, right? We can just get rid of this variable. And instead of doing a mouse position variable, we can just paste the function call to get global mouse position here inside of it. And just like that, the look at will work the exact same. And now we can move. Our character always looks towards the mouse. And I'm going to turn the character's speed down a little bit. 2 is a little high. Press play. And there we go. So now the character always looks towards the mouse even when they're moving. Awesome. So back over here. We've solved the problem with looking at, and we now have this scene to spawn in. So now we want to spawn in these objects. So let's do that. And the way we spawn in objects in Godot is we add it to the scene tree. As I've said before, the scene tree is just, you know, whatever this scene is, its root, and then all of its branches or children, right? That's all a scene tree is. So we're going to add it to the scene tree. And the way we do that is by creating a variable. I'm going to call it inst for instance, because we are going to take the projectile, and we're going to instantiate it just like this. And now I can't type this variable yet because if I try to give it a type, it's not going to know what a projectile is, right? We're going to get an error, all that. So I can't type it yet, but that's something we will fix soon. And so we have an instance of the projectile, but now we need to add it to the scene tree. And the way we do that is we add child. And by adding a child, and that child is going to be inst, by adding a child to the tree, we're saying that, hey, player character, where this script is, I want to add a projectile as a child to you. But I don't really want the projectile being part of the player character. I want it to be on its own in the map somewhere. Similar to how the player character is just on its own and it's a child of the level. I want, when I create a projectile, it to be a child of the level. I don't want it to be a child of the actual player character. So the way we do that is instead of saying just add child, we're going to say owner.addChild. And now this is going to get the owner of the player character, which in the main scene where the game is going to run is going to be main level. So now we've added the instance of the projectile to the main level. Awesome. Now, finally, what we need to do is spawn it in the correct location. And the way we do that, if I open up the player character scene real quick, is we're going to get the position 2D, and we're going to set the instance of this projectile's transform to be equal to that position 2D's transform. The problem is we need a reference to this position 2D, and we don't have one. Now we could export another variable, but there's an easier way to do it when you're dealing with child nodes, something that's relatively or relative to the script that we're on, right? And because position 2D is a child of player character where our script lives, we can actually get the position 2D by using the get node function and then passing in a string, which is the name of the node we want. So in this case, position 2D. And now we can do global transform. And there we go. And this will work. There's a better way to do this that I'll show in just a moment, but this will work. We will be instantiating objects at the position of that position 2D. Awesome. They're still not moving. We'll fix that in just a moment. But a better way to do this get node is there's a shorthand for the get node function, and that is $ and then the name of the node you want, so position 2D. And this will work the exact same way. Now, we can still improve on this by instead of having it here and referencing it in like the body of our code and potentially referencing it multiple times, we can actually store it as a variable. Now, why does that matter though? It matters because this is a string reference. Now it's dressed up nice and pretty now, but it's still a string reference, meaning that if I come over here and I change the name of position 2D to spawn point and hit enter, I'll go back to the script. We're not gonna get any errors here because this is still referencing just the string position 2D. It doesn't know that like the name has changed. So we have to keep these two things in sync. And there's actually a more advanced way to do this, but we're not going to do that right now. And that involves exporting and doing an onReady annotation and all of that. We're not going to do that yet. What we are going to do is we're going to instead give this a name. We'll call it spawn_point. And then we'll make that a variable here at the top of the script. Now I am going to use the onReady annotation. And the reason for that is I'm looking for a node, a path. And I don't want to look for spawn point if spawn point doesn't exist yet. Okay. So I'm going to say onReady var, and we will say spawn point, same as below, to make it a global variable. And then spawn point is going to be of type position 2D. And then we are going to assign it to that shorthand position 2D. Except for we're still going to have a problem here. Obviously, we're not going to be able to fix, doing this method, fix the fact that we're not getting any error handling. And that does bother me. But this is better because now when we change the name spawn point, we've used the spawn point variable through our code. So if we have like 5 or 10 places where we've placed the variable spawn point, we don't have to keep this name and the variable in sync. We just have to keep this name and this node reference in sync. So now we can do $spawn point. And now everything will be fine. To reiterate what this onReady does, it is very similar to calling the ready function in Godot and assigning like spawn point to the spawn point. There we go. It's similar to doing this. We're just packaging that up all nice right here in one line. So we don't have to call the ready function, okay? So now we have that. Everything's gonna work the exact same way. Yep, and we still don't have the projectiles moving yet. So let's go ahead and fix that. And while we're at it, we're gonna be able to get our projectile type in here so we can fix this untyped variable. So I'm gonna go to the projectile. And then on the projectile, I'm going to add a script. It's going to be a GD script, inherits from area 2D. It's going to be named projectile, no template. Fine, we'll create it. And then I'm going to give it a class name. And that's going to be projectile. Awesome. Now at this point, I believe, if I go back to my player script really quickly, we can actually go ahead and set this variable to projectile. And now the system knows what projectile is. So now we have that type safety again. Phew, okay. So back to projectile over here. We need to give our projectile a speed so it'll move. So we'll call it var speed. It's going to be a float. And we're going to assign it to 25.0. And then in order to actually make it move, because the speed alone won't do anything, in order to actually make it move, we're going to call the physics process. And here we're going to say that we want our position, and this position lives on a node. If I can come over here and click on like player character, here in transform, it has a position, right? So if it's a node in the world, it has a position. So back in the script, we want the position of our node to increase over time along the x-axis. So we'll do transform.x. And this is its relative x-axis. So when we spawn it in, it may not be pointing towards the right of the screen. It may spawn in facing like up or whatever. But this transform.x is always going to be relative to this node. So it's going to travel along its relative x-axis. And we're just going to multiply that by the speed. And just like that, if we press play, we have projectiles working. Wonderful. We'll close this out. I'll go back to the player character. And we're done. That's it. We've got it all working. Awesome. So in this video, we learned about instantiating objects, a little bit more about the scene tree and actually setting the position of an instantiated object. And we learned about projectiles and spawning them, the whole 9 yards. So in the next video or two, we are going to talk about enemies, and we're going to start spawning in enemies and making the projectiles damage enemies. It's going to be fun. So thank you so much for stopping by. This has been a dev named Josh, and I'll see you next time.